There is a photograph that sat on a nightstand in a country house in England for more than 60 years. A young woman, dark-eyed, caught in the soft light of 1914. She was a Russian Grand Duchess named Maria. She would be murdered in a cellar in Yekaterinburg at the age of 19, shot and bayoneted with the rest of her family, and the man who kept her picture beside his bed until the very last night of his life was one of the most powerful men in the British Empire. He was a war hero who nearly sank his own fleet. He was the architect of a nation's freedom whose signature helped kill as many as 1 million people. He was decorated, knighted, made an earl, handed the last great empire on the planet to dismantle, and for 40 years, a second file existed on him, one his own government never wanted you to see, that called him something no medal could cover. Here is the strange truth about Lord Louis Mountbatten. Almost nothing about his life went the way it was supposed to. He failed at sea and rose. He failed in battle and was promoted. He failed at the single most important job he was ever given, and history called it a triumph. Every door that should have shut on him swung open instead, and the one secret that should have destroyed him stayed buried, almost forever. So tonight, we are going to open the doors, one by one, because the more you look at this man's life, the more you realize it wasn't destiny that carried him. It was a series of very human choices, his and other people's, that could each have gone the other way. Let's start with the accident of his birth, because you cannot understand a single thing this man did without it. He was born on the 25th of June, 1900, and they named him Louis, though the family called him Dickie. His mother was Princess Victoria of Hesse. His great-grandmother, his actual great-grandmother, was Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, Empress of a quarter of the world. When they carried the infant to the font to be baptized, the godparents they chose tell you everything. His godmother was the Queen herself, and his godfather was his own cousin, a man named Nicholas, or Nicholas II, the last emperor Russia would ever have. Think about that for a second. A baby held between the two most powerful monarchies on earth, and within 18 years, both of them would be gone. Victoria dead, the Romanovs slaughtered. As a child, Dickie visited Russia often. He knew the imperial family the way an ordinary boy knows his summer cousins. He ran through their palaces, and somewhere in those visits, he fell for the Grand Duchess Maria, and he never really got over it. That photograph, the one by his bed, it stayed there through to world wars, through a marriage, through every affair, through the end of the British Empire itself. A dead girl he'd loved as a boy, watching over him for the rest of his life. He was homeschooled until he was 10, then a boarding school, then the Royal Naval College. A few weeks before his 13th birthday, and here comes the first door, because as this boy is coming of age, Europe is tearing itself apart, and his family's name, Battenberg, has suddenly become a liability. It's German, and Britain, gripped by anti-German fury during the First World War, does not want German names anywhere near its throne. So in the summer of 1917, King George V does something extraordinary. He erases the family's German identity by royal decree. The royal house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha becomes, overnight, the House of Windsor, and the Battenbergs anglicize their name to something that sounds solidly, comfortably English, Mountbatten. Here's the door. In another version of this century, that name change never happens. The anti-German hysteria doesn't quite reach the palace, and a young man, Louis Battenberg, spends his life as a faintly foreign figure at the edge of British power. Never fully trusted, never handed the keys to the empire. Instead, he becomes Mountbatten, as English as a name can sound, and the whole world opens up. He would spend the rest of his life walking through doors that opened because of who his relatives were. The question that follows him, the question we're going to keep asking, is simple. Did he ever once deserve it? Hold that thought, because the next door opens onto the sea, and onto a nickname the Royal Navy gave him that he could never quite shake. Louis enlisted in the Royal Navy at 16, a midshipman on the battle cruiser HMS Lion, and to his credit, genuine credit, he actually saw combat. In the summer of 1916, his cruiser was caught up in a naval action, and the teenage lord was there for it. In the smoke and the noise, doing his job. He specialized in communications, in signals, in the new electric nervous system of the modern fleet. He had a real fascination with gadgets, with technology, with the machinery of war. In 1924, he went to the signals school at Portsmouth and studied electronics at Greenwich. This was not a stupid man. Let's be fair to him. He was curious, energetic, charming, and genuinely interested in how things worked. The trouble was the gap between what he was interested in and what he was good at. He got his first command of a cruiser in 1934, and let's be honest about why. It wasn't seamanship, it was the connections, because in the years after the First World War, this young officer had done something far more valuable to his career than master navigation. He'd become a friend of the future king. He accompanied the future Edward VIII on a royal tour of Australia, then Japan, then India, and the two men grew close. Mountbatten had learned the real secret of his life, that proximity to the crown was worth more than competence. Then the Second World War came, and the gap between the two became impossible to hide. In 1939, he took command of the destroyer HMS Kelly, and the Kelly became famous for its adventures, and infamous for its captain's mistakes. He saw a lot of action, Norway, the English Channel, the Mediterranean, but action is not the same as skill. On one occasion, he sailed the Kelly straight into a minefield. On another, he managed to ram it into a friendly British ship. His own men, the sailors whose lives depended on his judgment, were not impressed, and the fleet gave him a nickname that stuck, the Master of Disaster. Read that again. His fellow officers, the men who actually knew him, looked at his command and called him a disaster. And here is the pattern that defines his entire life. The pattern I want you to watch for from now on. In May of 1941, off the coast of Crete, German dive bombers finally caught the Kelly and sank her. 130 men went down with that ship. 130. And Mountbatten survived, was pulled from the water, and did what he always did. He turned catastrophe into legend. The story of the Kelly became a story of heroism. Noel Coward would make a film about it. The Master of Disaster became a war hero. Here's what I think. 130 men died under the command of an officer his own navy considered a liability, and the machinery of privilege converted their deaths into his glory. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just what happened. So here is the door. Imagine the Royal Navy of 1941 had promoted on competence alone, had quietly moved this well-connected amateur to a desk, the way it would have moved anyone else with his record. He never gets the Kelly. He never becomes a legend. He never gets the chance to fail at anything larger. But that's not the Navy he served in. In his Navy, the door opened, and the next room was bigger, and the price of his mistakes was about to go up. Now I want to give the man his due, because the near-miss story cuts both ways, and there is one moment where Mountbatten was right when almost everyone else was wrong. In October of 1941, during a lull in his war, he traveled to the United States, and he toured the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This was 3 months before the Japanese attack, and Mountbatten walked around that base, and he was appalled. He saw the ships lined up, the aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, the general air of a fleet at peace in a world at war, and something in him, the part that had actually studied his enemy, went cold. He pointed at a map. He talked about how the Japanese had opened the Russo-Japanese War decades earlier, with a surprise attack on Port Arthur, without any declaration. He talked about the British torpedo raid on the Italian fleet at Taranto, and he told the Americans, in effect, this is exactly where it will happen, and you are not ready. He was right. On the 7th of December, everything he'd feared came screaming out of the sky, and the American Pacific Fleet burned at its moorings, almost precisely as he'd predicted. Sit with the irony of that. The Master of Disaster, the man who couldn't keep his own destroyer out of a minefield, saw the greatest naval disaster of the century coming from 3,000 miles and 3 months away, and the professionals didn't listen. This is the door that opened for him the best possible way, because his prescience about Pearl Harbor earned him something priceless, the respect of the highest commanders in the war. He'd been right, publicly and dramatically, and being right at that altitude gets you noticed. But here's the other half of it, the near miss that isn't about him at all. What if they had listened? What if a single admiral at Pearl Harbor had taken the strange, gadget-loving Englishman seriously and dispersed the fleet, manned the guns, flown the patrols? Thousands of men might have lived. The war in the Pacific would have opened on entirely different terms. History almost turned on whether anyone believed a man with a reputation for buffoonery. They didn't, and so Pearl Harbor became Pearl Harbor, and for Mountbatten, the warning nobody heeded became the making of his reputation. He walks through the door into the most important years of his career and the most catastrophic mistakes of his life, because the next thing they handed him wasn't a warning to give, it was thousands of young men to command. And this time, when he got it wrong, there was no turning it into a legend. In 1942, Mountbatten was made Chief of Combined Operations, in charge of planning raids against occupied Europe, and in August of that year came the operation that should have ended him. It was called the Dieppe Raid, Operation Jubilee, a daylight assault on the German-held French coast. Roughly 6,000 troops went in, most of them Canadian, young men from Ontario and Saskatchewan and the prairies who had crossed an ocean to fight. They hit a beach that was overlooked by German guns, in daylight, against defenses that had not been softened. It was a slaughter. More than 3,300 of them were killed, wounded or captured. Over 60% of the force in a matter of hours. More than 900 dead on the sand. Nearly 2,000 marched off into captivity. It was one of the most lopsided disasters the Western Allies suffered in the entire war. There is a defense of Dieppe. That the lessons learned there, the terrible knowledge of how not to assault a fortified port, saved lives on D-Day 2 years later. Historians still argue it, and that argument deserves to be on the table. But I want you to hold to things at once. Yes, lessons were learned, and also, a man his own service had nicknamed the Master of Disaster helped plan an operation that got 60% of its men killed, wounded, or captured in an afternoon. And he kept his career. Read that number one more time. 60%. And he failed upward, because here is where the pattern stops being funny. When the Master of Disaster ran a destroyer aground, the cost was a career's worth of embarrassment. When he planned Dieppe, the cost was measured in the telegrams that went out to thousands of Canadian mothers. The stakes of his failures were climbing, and the doors kept opening anyway. In August of 1943, Winston Churchill personally elevated him to one of the most important positions of the entire war, acting full admiral, Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia Command. He was now responsible, in theory, for the reconquest of Burma and the survival of British power across a whole region of the globe. Luckily, and this is the quiet truth of his war, there were serious people around him whose job was, in effect, to manage him. In Southeast Asia, he kept pitching reckless, impractical schemes for amphibious assaults, and his experienced planning staff kept quietly sidelining them. The system had learned to root around him. He held the title, other men held the competence. And here is the door I keep coming back to. Every single time this man failed, someone chose to promote him and other than remove him. Not fate. People, named. Real people who looked at Dieppe and looked at his bloodline and made a decision. Take away those decisions. Promote the competent men instead. And Mountbatten ends the war as a footnote. A charming aristocrat with an unfortunate record. Instead, they were about to hand him something no footnote is ever handed. They were about to hand him a fifth of humanity, and a deadline, and a map. But before that map, one small scene that tells you exactly who he was in a room full of the powerful. In 1945, he attended the Potsdam Conference, where the victors of the war carved up the peace. Among the men in those rooms was Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator. the man whose Bolshevik revolution had swept away the Russian imperial family, the family Mountbatten had loved as a boy, the cousins, the Grand Duchess whose photograph still sat by his bed, and Mountbatten, wanting an invitation to visit the Soviet Union, wanting to be liked, always wanting to be liked, decided the way to charm Joseph Stalin was to tell him, warmly, about his own close connections to the Russian imperial family. Let that land. He tried to win over the man most responsible for destroying the Romanovs by bragging about how close he'd been to the Romanovs. It's almost too perfect, the vanity of it, the staggering absence of self-awareness. Here is a man who could not read a room to save his life, standing in front of the most dangerous person in it, reaching for the one subject guaranteed to fall flat, because his own self-importance was louder than his judgment. I bring this up not to mock him. Well, not only to mock him, but because in 3 months, this exact quality, this blend of vanity and haste and blindness to consequence, was going to be turned loose on 300 million people, and the results would not be a diplomatic awkwardness at a dinner. The results would be one of the largest and bloodiest human migrations in the history of the world, because after the war, the powers that be in London made a decision about Lord Mountbatten. They gave him grand titles, Viscount, then Earl, that looked like rewards. But some who watched closely understood what those honours really were. They were a polite way of getting him out of the way. And the way you get a man like this out of the way, in 1947, is you send him as far from London as the empire reaches. You send him to India, to preside over the end of the empire itself. The door to the largest stage on earth had just opened, and on the other side of it, a fifth of humanity was waiting. On the 20th of February, 1947, Louis Mountbatten was named the last Viceroy of India. His job, the largest job any Briton would be handed in the 20th century, was to oversee the transition of the Indian subcontinent from British rule to independence. His instructions were specific, and they matter. London, playing a subtler colonial game now, told him to do everything in his power to avoid partition, to hand over a single, united India, but he was also given flexibility, adapt to the situation, and above all, make Britain look as good as possible on the way out. He landed in Delhi in March of 1947, and the ground was already shaking. Riots broke out almost immediately, in Delhi, in Bombay, in Rawalpindi. Hindu and Muslim communities that had lived beside each other for centuries were being torn apart by the terror of what independence might mean for whoever ended up on the wrong side of a line that didn't yet exist. His own advisors counseled patience, a gradual, careful transfer of power, time to get it right. London had given him until the middle of 1948, the better part of 18 months. Mountbatten looked at the deadline and cut it nearly in half. He decided that gradual transfer would only mean a longer slide into civil war, and that the answer was to move fast, quick and orderly, get it over with. And so he made the fateful decision that the country had to be split in two, India and Pakistan, a Hindu majority nation and a Muslim majority one, partition. Now watch the door that closes here, because this is the one that haunts me. Among the people begging him not to do it was Mahatma Gandhi himself, the moral center of the entire independence movement, who was desperate for India to remain united. And Gandhi came to Mountbatten with an astonishing proposal: invite Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the Muslim leader, the man who would become the founder of Pakistan, to lead a central government of a united India, hand your rival the premiership, and rather than break the country in two. It was a long shot. It might have failed, but it was a door. Mountbatten never even relayed the offer to Jinnah. He didn't carry the message, the one idea that might have held the subcontinent together, and the Viceroy of India left it die in his own hands, unspoken. Some say he was too blinded by his own sense of importance to take it seriously. Whatever the reason, the door closed, and no one on the other side ever knew it had been open. They brought in a British lawyer and Cyril Radcliffe to draw the actual border. Radcliffe had never set foot in India. He had no experience drawing boundaries. He was given roughly 5 weeks, to carve a line through a land of 300 million people, dividing villages, farms, families, the sacred sites of entire communities. He objected to the timeline. Everyone insisted the line be finished by the 15th of August, and so it was. Partition became official on the 15th of August, 1947, and Mountbatten, years later, described that night. He said he was alone in his study in the Viceroy's mansion, and that for a few minutes he felt himself the most powerful man on earth. The most powerful man on earth. Now hear what that power actually brought. As the line was revealed, the subcontinent convulsed. Muslims fled toward Pakistan. Hindus and Sikhs fled toward India. It became the largest mass migration in modern human history. An estimated 14 to 15 million people uprooted. Trains arrived at stations filled with corpses. Neighbors murdered neighbors. Women were abducted and killed by the tens of thousands. The most credible estimates of the dead run from several 100,000 to as many as 1 to 2 million people. And the man in the study felt, for a few minutes, like the most powerful man on earth. Here's what I think, and I want to be fair about it. Partition may have been coming no matter who held the pen. The pressures were enormous, the hatreds were real, and no single Englishman created them. That's true, and it belongs in the record. But the speed was his. The having of the timeline was his choice. The undelivered message to Jinnah was his silence, and the deaths that came from doing it too fast, with too little care, in a rush to make Britain look decisive on the way out. Those belong, in part, to him. His bumbling had always meant misery for everyone but himself. At sea, it had cost his sailors. At Dieppe, it had cost the Canadians. And now, on the largest stage in the world, it cost a number so large the mind slides off it. And you already know what happened to Mountbatten. He failed upward again, the very next day, the 15th of August. At the request of the new Indian Prime Minister, he became the first Governor-General of independent India. Another title, another honor. He helped persuade the princely states to join the new nation, and he won admirers for it even as Pakistan came to despise him for what they saw as his hostility. He went home eventually, resumed his naval career, and rose all the way to First Sea Lord, the very post his own father had held 40 years before. The circle closed, the failure was complete, and it looked, from the outside, exactly like a triumph, but there was a second file, and it's time to open it. Here is where we have to slow down, and be careful, and be honest, because we are now in the territory of the open case. What follows is not settled history, it is allegation and evidence and denial, and I'm going to give you all three, and let you sit with the discomfort of not knowing for certain. That discomfort is the honest place to be. For the whole of his public life, Louis Mountbatten was a portrait of establishment respectability. He and his wife Edwina were, on paper, England's great power couple, and the affairs were an open secret. He himself once admitted that he and Edwina spent their entire married lives climbing into other people's beds. After Edwina died in 1960, he became notorious for relationships with much younger women, including a long affair with the actress Shirley MacLaine. That much is not in dispute, and by the standards of scandal it's almost quaint. But underneath the affairs, for more than 40 years, a darker set of rumours followed him. Whispers in magazines like Private Eye, claims over decades that his interest ran to young boys. For most of his life, these were only whispers, and then, in 2019, something changed. A Freedom of Information request by the British historian Andrew Loney pried loose a file, an FBI dossier that American intelligence had begun compiling in 1944, after Mountbatten was made Supreme Allied Commander, and that file, in the flat, bureaucratic language of an intelligence report, called Lord and Lady Mountbatten persons of extremely low morals. The specific, damning phrase came from an interview with a British aristocrat, Baroness Dieppe. She told the FBI that in her circles, Mountbatten was known to be, in her words, a homosexual with a perversion for young boys. Now, be careful here. That is hearsay. One aristocrat reporting a reputation to an American agent in the 1940s. It is not proof of anything. Reputation is not evidence. And gossip written down by the FBI is still gossip. Hold that firmly. But it doesn't end with the file, because in 2019, when Louis published his book, two men came forward independently. Both said they had been 16 years old in the summer of 1977. Both said they had been taken from a place called Kincra, a boys' home in East Belfast that would itself become the centre of one of the darkest abuse scandals in the history of Northern Ireland, and both said they were driven to Mountbatten's holiday castle in Sligo, in the Republic of Ireland, and abused there, one of them, later willing to give up his anonymity. A former Kincra resident named Arthur Smythe made his accusation publicly. Another, known only as Sean, described the drive from the home to the castle. Now, the counter case, which you deserve to hear with equal weight. Mountbatten's naval contemporaries, the men who served with him, have stated emphatically that they do not believe the stories. Some pointed out that no complaint was made at the time. Kincra itself has been the subject of wild and sometimes unprovable conspiracy theories for decades, tangled up with claims about intelligence agencies, which makes every allegation attached to it harder, not easier, to verify. Memories across 40 years are fragile. Financial motive can enter, and the man himself is dead and cannot answer. All of that is real, and none of it should be waved away. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with an open case. On one side, a wartime FBI file, decades of independent rumor, and to men telling similar stories they did not have to tell. On the other, no contemporaneous complaint, the denials of those who knew him, the notorious murk of the Kincra affair, and the basic principle that a dead man cannot defend himself. I'm not going to tell you I know what he did behind those doors. Nobody honest can. What I can tell you that the questions are serious. The sources are more than tabloid noise, and the establishment that protected his reputation in life worked very hard to keep these questions from ever being asked. Which brings us to the strangest near miss of all. The truth about this man almost never surfaced at all. His private diaries and his wife's letters were locked away, and the British government spent years and a fortune in legal fees fighting to keep parts of them secret. A fight that only ended, in part, because of Louis's persistence. The file that named him sat sealed in Washington for the better part of a century. History almost let Lord Mountbatten keep the polished version of himself forever. It came within an inch of working, and that is the deepest theme of his whole life. Not just that he failed upward, but that he was protected upward. That the same machinery which turned a sunk destroyer into a legend, and a bungled partition into a statesman's triumph, also stood ready to bury whatever needed burying, almost successfully. But there was one thing not even the British establishment could protect him from. It was waiting for him on the water. In the last place on earth he felt safe. By the 1970s, Mountbatten had settled into a comfortable old age. He was, by then, a beloved elder of the royal family. He had been especially close to his great-nephew, a young man named Charles, the future King Charles III. Charles called him his honorary grandfather, and Mountbatten, who had never quite managed to settle down himself, cheerfully encouraged the young prince to enjoy the bachelor life. He was, to that boy, a mentor and a guide. Every summer he went to Ireland. He had a holiday home, Classy-born Castle, in the northwest, near the little harbour of Mullimore, and he loved it there. He loved to take his small wooden boat, the Shadow V, out onto the water to check the lobster pots and fish. It was his peace. It was where the most powerful man on earth got to be. For a few weeks a year, just an old man in a boat. But look at the map. Mullimore sits only about a dozen miles from the border with Northern Ireland, and in 1979, Northern Ireland was in the depths of the Troubles. To the Provisional IRA, Lord Mountbatten was not an old man fishing. He was the British Empire itself, in the flesh. spending his summers unguarded within easy reach. The security warnings had been raised for years. He was, in the coldest tactical terms, a soft target sitting in the open, and he did not take it seriously enough. He kept coming back. On the night of the 26th of August, 1979, ANIRA Thomas Mountbatten slipped down to the harbour where the Shadow V was moored. He and a bomb team had built a device packed with around 50 pounds of gelignite, and he planted it aboard the little wooden boat, wired to a radio control. Then he and another man drove away into the dark. The next morning was bright and calm. Mountbatten, now 79, went down to the boat with a small party, family and a local boy, his 14-year-old grandson, Nicholas's twin brother, Timothy, their grandmother, the 83-year-old Dowager Lady Brabourne, and a 15-year-old local boy named Paul Maxwell, who worked as a crewman and was thrilled to have the job. They puttered out of the harbour to check the lobster pots. They were only a few hundred yards from shore when a man on the shore pressed a button. The bomb tore the boat apart. Mountbatten was killed. So was Nicholas, 14 years old. So was Paul Maxwell, 15. The Dowager Lady Brabourne, terribly injured, died of her wounds the following day. Timothy, Nicholas's twin, survived, badly hurt, pulled from the water. On the same afternoon, in a separate, coordinated attack at Warren Point, the IRA killed 18 British soldiers. It was one of the bloodiest days of the entire conflict. Thomas Mountbatten was arrested that same day, at a routine checkpoint, before the bomb even went off, stopped for something unrelated, 80 miles away. The forensics did the rest, traces of the explosive on his clothes, flecks of the Shadow V's green and white paint on his boots, sand from Mullermore in the treads. He was sentenced to life. He served 19 years and was released under the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Here is the last near miss, and it is the cruelest one, because for once the man who felled upward all his life was not the one who paid. 3 of the dead were not powerful. They were an old woman, and 2 boys who had barely started living. Nicholas Knatchbull, 14, Paul Maxwell, 15. If Mountbatten had listened to the security warnings, if he had stayed off the water that summer, if he had simply not gone out that bright morning, those 2 boys would very likely have grown old. The door was open. The warnings had been given for years, and, as he had done his whole life, he walked past them without looking. Only this time the course landed on children instead of on him. So let's stand back and look at the whole staircase of doors. He was born into the accident of royal blood, and when his German name became dangerous, the crown itself rewrote his identity to keep the doors open. He failed at sea, sank a destroyer with 130 men aboard, and was made a legend. He helped plan a raid that lost 60% of its men, and was promoted to Supreme Allied Commander. He was sidelined into the largest job on earth, have the deadline, buried the one idea that might have kept India whole, and presided over a partition that displaced 15 million and killed as many as 1 million, and was rewarded with a governorship. And beneath all of it ran a second life, hidden, that the establishment nearly kept sealed forever. Every one of those was a door. And here is the thing I most want you to take away. Not one of them was fate. Every single one was a human choice. Someone chose to change the name. Someone chose to promote the master of disaster instead of retiring him. He chose to cut India's timeline in half. He chose not to carry Gandhi's message. Someone chose to lock the diaries and fight 4 years to keep them shut. He chose to keep sailing out of that harbour after the warnings. That's what the near-miss lens really shows you. We're taught to see history as a machine, inevitable, grinding forward, no one to blame. But when you get close enough to a single life, the machine dissolves into 1,000 ordinary decisions, any one of which could have gone the other way. India might have stayed whole. 2 boys in a boat might have grown old. 130 sailors might have had a competent captain. The whole thing was contingent. All of it. It hung, again and again, on choices. Here's what I actually think about Louis Mountbatten. After sitting with all of it, I don't think he was a monster in the cartoon sense. I think he was something more ordinary and, in a way, more dangerous. He was a man of enormous privilege and average judgment who was never once allowed to fail like a normal person. And so he never learned the thing that failure teaches. He never developed the humility, the caution, the fear of consequence that keeps most of us from doing terrible things carelessly. Every time he got it wrong, the system caught him and lifted him higher. And the man who is never allowed to hit the ground never learns how far the fall really is. The way I see it, the tragedy of Mountbatten is not really about Mountbatten. It's about everyone the machine dropped so that he could keep flying. The sailors on the Kelly, the Canadians on the beach at Dieppe, the uncounted dead of partition, whose names we will never know, whose only memorial and a number so large it stops meaning anything, and to boys in a small wooden boat on a bright August morning. And this is the part that gets me. We remember him as an earl, a war hero, the last viceroy, the mentor of a king, the grand version, the version the machine built. It took an FBI file that sat sealed for decades, and a historian who wouldn't let go, and to men willing to say the unsayable. To even crack that version open, the truth about him almost stayed buried. It came within an inch of never being asked, which makes you wonder how many other polished statues are hollow. How many other men were carried through every door by nothing but the accident of their blood, and are remembered as great because the people they failed had no way to write the record. There is one image I keep returning to, an old man, alone in a study in the Viceroy's mansion on the night he split a subcontinent in two, feeling, in his own words, like the most powerful man on earth, and a photograph, far away, of a Russian girl who'd been dead for 30 years. A girl he'd loved as a boy, whose whole world had also been swept away by forces larger than any single life. He kept her picture by his bed until the morning the bomb went off. Maybe, in some corner of himself, he understood what she'd learned in that cellar in Yekaterinburg, that no amount of royal blood makes you safe, and no title, in the end, protects you from the consequences of the century you helped to shape. He just never learned it in time to spare anyone else. If this story stayed with you, do me a favor, hit like and subscribe, so these forgotten truths keep finding their way to daylight. And if you want to see another life where history came within inches of turning the other way, go watch our episode on the warning that could have stopped Pearl Harbor, the one an Englishman gave 3 months early, and nobody believed. It connects to this story in a way you won't expect. We'll see you behind the next door.